Hello and welcome. This is Maria from Kitchen Sink Stamps. Have you ever wondered what's the best way to stamp when using our coordinating SVG cut files? In this video, I'd like to show you how to stamp Kitchen Sink Stamps' layer stamps using a jig and how easy it is to mass produce stamped cutouts. After cutting a full sheet of Plumeria Flowers and leaves using the coordinating SVG cut file, trim off the upper left corner of the outer portion of the cutout. This piece will become the stamping jig. I have placed a small piece of sticky grid in my stamping platform. The sticky grid will help keep the jig in place while I stamp each of the cutouts. When stamping with a jig, it is best to start with stamp number 1 and an empty jig. The stamp will fit right inside the cutout opening. You can almost feel as the stamp drops into place. I'm going to apologize up front for when my head comes into the shot, but the best way to align layered stamps is to get directly over the stamp and look straight down through the stamp to see if it's aligned correctly. After all 3 flower stamps have been placed onto the stamping platform, it is now time to insert the blank cutouts into the jig. Some of the cutouts are easy to tell which side is up and the side that you should be stamping on, like the flower with the small stem. But more circular shaped flowers, such as the big Plumeria blossom, will take a little playing around and maybe flipping over until you find the right fit. I use the biggest petal to help me find the correct side and orientation. You will notice that I run my finger along the edge of the cutouts in the jig. I do this for 2 reasons. 1, to make sure that the cutout fits all the way around the shape inside the jig, and 2, to smooth down any burrs on the edge of the cutouts that may have happened during the time it was being cut. If a small burr on the edge of a cutout has caused any issues, no need to re-ink. Usually an extra press with your fingers in that spot will fix the problem. After stamping one set of cutouts with do-si-do, I like to use tweezers to remove the cutouts. This is done by placing one tip of the tweezers right down in the cut line and lifting up and pulling it out. I prefer to place each different shaped flower in its own pile. This helps me stay organized while I'm stamping multiple shapes and color combinations in one stamping session. I will repeat the process until all the flowers have been stamped with step number 1 in do-si-do. For this stamping session, I decided ahead that I wanted to stamp 2 different color sets of the flowers. One set in a pinky red and the second set in a pinky orange. I like to create cards where the flowers have slightly different shades of color, especially when I overlap the flowers. The different shades of similar color will add depth to the overall flower arrangement. Before I started, I got all my inks organized into 2 separate stacks. They're off screen, but I will show them to you as we go. I'm going to speed up the repetitive parts while stamping 6 sets of each flower. I am using a version of a stamp glider or Chucky. These sorts of devices really do help to apply even pressure when stamping an impression. I also find it helps prevent wrist fatigue when you're stamping a lot. You may notice some of the stamping during this first layer may come out a bit blotchy. I personally think that with flowers and leaves, this can add to the beauty of the finished image. After all the flowers have been stamped, it is now time to move on to step number 2. I usually align the next layer into place by using the most solid portion of the stamp and corner areas. But when in doubt, I do check with the stamp alignment guide, which can be found online or in the stamp packaging. You will see that I move the stamp up and down and around until I have a spot that looks right. Then I move on to a second spot and a third. After I've had 3 spots aligned, I will give the alignment one quick look for good measure. Sometimes a stamp might need a tiny little push from the tweezers or the back of my nail to give the stamp a little nudge to move it into the right spot. But you really don't have to be this precise. They're flowers, and if the alignment is a little bit off, it's okay. Plus, the added bonus with stamping onto SVG cutouts, the cutout will hide if a stamp is a little bit out of alignment. Once all 3 stamps to step number 2 have been aligned, I will stamp all 6 sets in Coral Cabana. I will continue with this process of filling the jig and stamping and placing each stamped flower again in its own pile when it is finished. These little piles help me keep myself organized, especially when I start using more than one color for a stamp step, as you will see when we start stamping step number 3. A side note about cleaning stamps. I like to clean my stamps with a damp microfiber cloth and then have a second dry cloth to pat the stamps dry before I put them back on the back of the ID film. All clear stamp cleaners are great to use for cleaning photopolymer stamps, except for solvent stamp cleaners, such as the ones from StazOn. They can actually melt photopolymer stamps. But when I use inks in the red and purple family, especially the darker shades, I do find that using ink off stamp cleaner really helps. It lifts up the extra pigments in these color families that really like to stain photopolymer stamps. Okay, now that step number 2 is finished, it's time to move on to step number 3. For this layer, I'm going to mix it up a bit and stamp 3 sets of the flowers in Tutti Frutti and 3 sets in Samba. For aligning step 3, again, I start with the most solid area of the stamp and align it with the most solid area that was previously stamped. Then I move the stamp to fit into the corners. This is my preference, but when I'm stamping more than one stamp at one time, I like to add a maximum of 2 stamps to the stamping platform at one time. When I try to add more than 2, I will always bump one of the other stamps and then have to start all over again. I am going to stamp the first 3 sets of flowers in Tutti Frutti. I love how the flower is starting to take on dimension. This usually happens by the 3rd layer. I am now going to divide the piles into 2 separate piles, 3 each for Tutti Frutti on the left and 3 each for Samba on the right. Again, this is just my way of keeping myself organized. You should do whatever works best for you. For the next 3 sets of flowers, I'm still going to stamp in step number 3, but this time I'm going to be using the color Samba. The Samba will make this set of flowers look a little more red than the other set of flowers done with Tutti Frutti that will look a little more orange. Now all 6 sets of step number 3 are finished. It's time to move on to step number 4. I think with the Plumeria set, layers number 2, number 3, and number 4 are fairly easy to align. Layers number 5 and number 6 can get a little tricky and just needs a little more practice. I am going to align step number 4 the exact same way as I did for steps number 2 and number 3. With the tip of the tweezer, I am pointing out some of the alignment spots I like to use for lining up the large blossom. I apologize, but it appears that my camera's battery died, and I did not realize it until halfway shooting step number 4. But since I stamped this step all the same, I did not reshoot it. This time I will be stamping step number 4, both sets, in Mandarin Spice, but 2 times each. When I stamped it the first time, the color did not look dark enough, so I stamped step number 4 with Mandarin Spice for a second time. After the second stamping, the color looked darker and I liked it much better. Even though I stamped step number 4 all in the same color, I'm still keeping the flowers in 2 separate piles. Now that step 4 is done, it's time for step 5. With step 5, though there is less solid portions of the stamp to help with alignment, I am still aligning the stamp the same way. I'm picking 3 spots to align. This step may just take a little more time to align or a little practice to find the spot that works best for you. For this layer, I'm going to use 2 different colors again. One set, the pile on the left, in the color Flame. The second set, the pile on the right, in the color Flirty Fuchsia, stamped 2 times each. I personally find stamping with cutouts and a jig a huge time saver. Yes, I might be stamping a bit more now, but I think this method saves a lot of time by only having to align each layer only once while stamping a set of 3 images 6 times. That's a total of 18 flowers with minimal alignment. Plus, then I have the flowers for whenever I need a quick card. And I may not know what design I want to do yet, but I have the freedom to move the flowers around and come up with a card design that I might not have thought of. And plus, anytime I can make a card without having to mask anything really makes me happy. Step 5 is now finished, and we're on to our last layer, step number 6. Step number 6 can be a little tricky to align. This is when I like to use the color ID film for a little help. Flip the ID film over so the right side is facing up. It is not necessary to remove any of the stamps from the back of the ID film. Move the ID film over the stamped image until the ID film lines up with the stamped image below. Next, with the actual stamp, match the orientation with the ID film. Once I have the correct orientation of the stamp, I can now remove the ID film and align the stamp easily. Step number 6 is fairly easy to align for the flower with the stem, so the ID film isn't needed. Here is a close-up view of using the color ID film for helping with the orientation and placement of step number 6 for the smaller flower. Now that the layer using step number 6 for all 3 flowers are in place, I will stamp the first 3 sets of flowers in the color Glam. Another benefit from stamping with a jig and multiple cutouts is the ink with each stamping has a chance to dry in between the next layer. I find that when the ink of a layer can dry before the next layer of ink, the details stay sharp and crisp. When I stamp one layer of ink right on top of a layer that hasn't fully dried, the 2 inks will blend a little, making the detail of the image softer. This looks great when I'm stamping layered water or animals like a teddy bear, or for anything where I want the image to have a softer look. For the next 3 sets of flowers, the pile on the left, still using step number 6, I will be stamping the color Cranberry Fizz. While I am stamping this last set of flowers, I can see that there is really not as much of a color variance between the 2 different sets of flowers as I had intended. But there is a really easy fix for this. Right now, both sets look more pinky red, and I want one of those sets to look more pinky orange. So I'm going to take the last set that I stamped, the flowers on the left, which is leaning more towards orange, and I'm going to add yellow. I'm going to add the yellow by going back to step number 1 and stamp it again. Yes, it's sort of like painting with stamps. If a color isn't how you want it, add another color on top. Dye inks make it really easy to mix colors by layering them. This is also a great way to extend your inks. If you don't have a deep red, take the red you have and add purple on top. It'll dry back to look like a deep red. When making adjustments by adding more color, I find it is best to add the color slowly. So I am going to use the lightest yellow that I have, which is the color Chiffon. The chiffon looks pretty good, but I think I can add a little deeper yellow to make the flowers a little more orangey. So the next step of flowers I will stamp will be using the color Limoncello. I think this will make the flowers look a little more pinky orange, sort of coral, which is what I'm looking for. Yes, that looks really good. But just for fun, to see if there is any change after the stamp images dry, for the last set of flowers, I'm going to stamp Limoncello twice. Here is a close-up of both sets of flowers after they have fully dried. I love how they turned out. You can see the flowers on the left do have a slight variation of yellow. I will leave the color recipe for both in the description below. So this is how I stamp SVG cutouts using a jig. I hope this video encourages you to try stamping with a jig. For another fun video, please watch how to quickly make a twin card. I hope you found this video helpful, and if so, please hit the like button to let me know that you'd like to see more videos like this one. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a fabulous and crafty day.